Welcome everyone to the of the SPIPA Australia. SPIPA, for those who haven't seen this before, it's the Strategic Partnership for Implementation of the Paris Agreement. This is the Australian arm of this. It's essentially a collaboration between Europe and a range of key economies around the world, including Australia, to strengthen the case and support for climate action and build networks to do that. This is the wrap-up of a culmination of several months worth of work. Before I start, I should introduce myself. My name is Peter Rayner. I'm the Australian lead for the activity. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. I also want to thank the European Commission and the German government for their support of the activity, as well as Melbourne Climate Futures at the University of Melbourne, who've supported us in a whole range of ways. Today, we're going to focus really around what happens during an energy transition. So we're going to focus on this from a couple of different perspectives. Perspectives from the communities who are affected, who are generally involved somewhere in industries that will be deeply touched by the energy transition. And to do that, we have Amanda Cahill from Next Economy. We'll introduce her in a second. And then the launch of a fairly large piece of work, a report on the comparison between Europe and Australia of the approaches to energy poverty and energy affordability. And that's a report we'll be launching as part of this, spearheaded by a pair of organizations, University of Melbourne and the Öko-Institut from Germany. So that's going to take up most of our time today. But for our first topic, I want to welcome Amanda Cahill to talk a little bit about a piece of work that she and her group of the Next Economy have been doing about kind of communities in transition. And this is something where obviously both Europe and Australia have had to think quite hard about what to do to support communities who are going to be adversely affected by a really fairly significant industrial transformation that's happening in the energy and related sectors. So without kind of any further ado on my part, I'll hand over to Amanda.
Thanks, Peter. So you can hear me all right?
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. So the Next Economy had the great fortune of partnering with the Melbourne Climate Futures to host an international discussion on basically what we're learning helps communities that are going through transition and what actually makes a just transition. Before I get into it, I would like to acknowledge my colleague Nikki Fluke, who did most of the work in pulling together the roundtable, as well as Professor John Wiseman and Professor Catherine Bowen from the Melbourne Climate Futures and the University of Melbourne for their support of this work. So the aim of the project was really to bring together leading thinkers like academics and policymakers, as well as practitioners who are deeply engaged in supporting regions and countries to manage the transition. And we decided to focus on three countries, so Australia, Germany and Poland, as three different kind of examples of different ways of approaching the policy context around managing transition. So we ended up with about 45 people. It was a mix of academics and policymakers, activists on the ground who are doing grassroots organising, unionists. We had a strong union representation, and also economic development or community development practitioners working on the ground with communities. Around half of the participants were Australian and a quarter from Germany and Poland each. So while we were focused on what we could learn from the different experiences of these three countries, we wanted to, put a spin on focusing on what has worked. There's a lot of discussion in this space about where we're failing and what's not working for workers and communities. But we actually wanted to flip that and say, well, there's actually been decades now of attempts to try and manage this. So what can we learn that works? What are the things that open up spaces for change and to move things forward in a more positive direction? Excuse me. Sorry, I'm not well today. So our focus was on, some of the solutions. And it was focused on dialogue. So instead of having panel discussions, we wanted to flip that as well and actually create spaces for sharing between people who are very deeply engaged on the topic. So this required quite a bit of prep work before we went into the discussion, so that people could understand the context a little bit before they entered into dialogue with others. So we did a number of interviews with our German and Polish colleagues to understand the context there. Nikki prepared a number of country briefings summarising kind of history and discussions at a national level around the energy transition. We surveyed participants beforehand on the challenges that they see are the main things that are facing their countries, particularly in terms of the social, economic and political challenges, because we felt that the technical and financial side of things, we kind of have a lot of solutions there. We wanted to focus on really what's still holding change back. Excuse me. And then on the night, we did a summary of what we'd found about the different contexts and those challenges, but really then got straight into dialogue. So we had 2 rounds of dialogue focused on what we could share with each other around things that we had tried that worked, policies and frameworks that had helped move things forward, events and other key things that had opened up spaces for change. So just to touch on some of the challenges that came out of the initial work we did, there were some, of course, different challenges in different countries. Germany had a lot less currently off the back of the Coal Commission that happened in 2018. There was a feeling that the national dialogue and debate around the just transition had moved on. There was a national acceptance that change was here. That was no longer up for debate. And really the challenges were on getting more detail around some of the targets that have been set and the policies in that. That was a very different context to, say, Australia and Poland, where there's still quite significant political opposition to discussing things like the phase out of coal, particularly in Poland, which was also facing a number of challenges in helping build renewable energy as well, which we haven't had as much in Australia. So the role of the fossil fuel industry and the influence over national politics, a very toxic kind of debate in both Poland and Australia that was very divisive in those countries. It was tied up in a sense of identity being attached to coal and extractive industries. In Poland as well, fears around energy security and a need, like so much dependence on coal, making that very difficult to have a different discussion, particularly as a resistance to having to depend on gas imports from Russia. In all countries, there was still a feeling that not enough was being done to support workers, particularly in Poland and Australia. We needed much better resourced programs in advance of any closures. And a lot more needed to be done in all countries around remediation and rehabilitation of sites, whether that was power plants or mines. Higher energy prices are making this a more difficult discussion around change. As is poverty and inequality, particularly in regions quite dependent on coal. A really interesting thing that came out was, I guess, the role of government and past experiences around who's responsible for managing change. In Germany, in parts of East Germany, from East German bloc, also Poland, where they're talking about the reunification of the country and the industrial changes that happened then and how many people were hurt. That's still a very live debate, nearly 30 years on into this discussion. And in Australia, there was also concerns about the history of how First Nations people have been treated, and that there's an opportunity to work more closely to really address a whole lot of issues around extractive industries and colonial practices. In all countries, there is some pushback against renewable energy. So we're seeing tensions around competing land use, people concerned about the environmental impacts of new renewable energy projects and wind farms, and just a general lack of regulation around how renewable energy projects are being rolled out. So that was the context that we set up the discussion to then kind of go, well, if that's the challenge, what are some of the solutions and ways forward around this? And there were some very strong themes that came through. What we did, we actually got people into similar groups for the first round of discussions for the first hour. So we put, unionists together, people working on grassroots climate activism together to see if there were some similarities in their experiences and things that they had tried. And then in the second round, we actually split the groups up and got them to report back to people who were doing very different kinds of work to themselves. But interestingly, the same themes came out across both rounds. One of the biggest elements around what's opening up spaces for change is time. There was, particularly in Germany, we keep talking about the shift in Germany being 2018, but there was a lot of people talking about the fact that this discussion about energy has been going on since the 70s. I'm so sorry about this. I don't have COVID, but I do have a cold. And so that time element, which is hard to control, but the fact that things are shifting now in Poland and Australia to create more space for that discussion because there has been more time passed. The importance of building power through diverse coalitions, especially in countries like Poland and Australia, where we haven't had that national leadership from government. So bringing together unions and environment groups and others at a grassroots level to lead that discussion and planning, and a much stronger focus on justice. Linked to that point is the importance of participation and inclusive processes for dialogue. And so in Germany, people pointed to the example of the Coal Commission, which was bringing together very different voices to actually work out what needed to be done. Similarly, there's been a lot of different groups in the Latrobe Valley, and that was highlighted as a strength. And it also where there's been some movement around engaging First Nations people in Australia and how powerful that has been in opening up a very different discussion about climate futures and need to act on fossil fuels. There's also discussion around how to make participation equitable and successful. So who gets to engage, who gets a seat at the table, how much time and resources do they have to participate, and how do you make that equitable? And how do you make it tailored to specific issues? So the importance of place-based solutions was being really important in that. There was also acknowledgement that we need to broaden the discussion, and we've seen this in the media over the last week. So often this discussion is very much around technology or power station closing down and the workforce. But there was a strong theme that actually these discussions need to have a broader economic development focus around how you're going to support an entire region. And where there's been success has been where there's been support for the entire region and to diversify its economic base. Where that hasn't happened is where there's still a lot of resistance. Another really strong theme was the importance of the labour movement and the role of unions, not just to support existing coal workers, but more broadly in the workforce. So some of the tensions around people losing their jobs, they're going from highly unionised workplaces into other areas that have had those rights disappear over the last couple of decades. So there's a lot of discussion about unions. And finally, to wrap up, having substantial funds available to support change at a national and regional level is obvious, but has been really important in the German example. Key policies, having a price on carbon, clear emissions reductions targets, and clear plans and targets to manage phase out, not just the rollout of renewable energy, is crucial. And lastly, I think the importance of sharing stories. Sharing stories and building really strong, powerful climate movements. And I'm going to leave it there because I can't talk anymore. I'm really sorry about that.
Thanks very much indeed for talking under obviously fairly difficult circumstances. Commiseration, you've got to be quite unlucky to get a cold at the moment, right? It's been hard to do for a while. So thanks very much for doing that. I'm probably not going to inflict extra Q&A on you. But I'd be quite happy at some point for you to follow up in the chat or something about how optimistic this left you feeling about. It sounds like we have quite a range of tools available to us to help these transitions. And I probably won't ask you to answer the question verbally, but I'd be interested to know, either offline or in the chat or something like that, whether you thought, yeah, I think we've got decent examples. If countries are willing, it looks like we can actually do this. People aren't just at the mercy of companies kind of arbitrarily bringing forward closure dates because suddenly they've realized that either the zeitgeist or just the economics of their industry has changed underneath them. And, you know, this is obviously a really difficult problem with companies changing the trajectories for these communities pretty much, you know, without much notice. So yeah.
I'll type. If people have questions, I'm happy to type. That's probably a good way to go. And I'll also add into the chat what's come out of the discussion and the next steps for the dialogue. So right. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Yeah, I won't ask you to talk much more. So that's, if you like, us looking at one half of the problems, looking at communities who are impacted specifically because they're involved in parts of the relevant industries and how we might support them. The other half is to think about consumers particularly and how they might be affected, particularly if there's a decent chance that if we're not careful, there can be spikes in energy costs. There certainly have been at various stages during energy transitions in countries around the world, including parts of Australia. And to do that, that was one of our major pieces of research. And today we're launching kind of the report that's come out of that work. The way we're going to run this is I'm going to first introduce Sangeetha Chandra-Shekeran, who'll be leading the rest of the discussion for it. And then Sangeetha will be introducing a whole range of people who've been involved in this work as we do a kind of tag team for the rest of this. So Sangeetha is a senior research fellow at the University of Melbourne, has been kind of involved in a range of roles, but really thinking about this interaction between people's kind of life course, life history, and various aspects of equity and sustainability. Most recently, she had a role as the director of the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, which sought to bring together a lot of these pieces of work, and some of the activities involved in that are pretty close to what SPIPA has been involved in. So Sangeetha, I'll hand over to you, get myself back out of the way, and let you run the rest of the session.
Thanks very much, Peter. It's great to be here. I'm speaking to you from Wurundjeri country in now Melbourne, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging leaders. Peter gave a good introduction. I am Senior Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne, specifically on an Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for children and families over the life course. This project that we're going to discuss was funded by the European Union's partnership instrument, and it was also partly supported by the Centre of Excellence that I just mentioned. So the project is aiming to share knowledge about best practice approaches to keep household electricity prices and bills down. And that includes a real focus on vulnerable consumers. So we've grounded this research in insights from European member states and the European Union, and also Australian developments. And we were motivated by the question as to whether a cleaner, greener electricity system necessarily has to mean rising costs for consumers. Could electricity decarbonisation lead to improvements in affordability? And to do this, as part of a team, we analysed cost drivers, we looked at regulatory frameworks and interventions to try and mitigate hardship and address energy poverty. So this comparative piece of work could not be done alone at the University of Melbourne. It was really invaluable to have our European partners from the Öko-Institut, which is based in Berlin. And I'll let Johanna tell us a bit more about the Institute. So on the University of Melbourne side, there was myself and Dr. Dylan McConnell, who might be joining us a bit later. And from Öko, we have Johanna Cludius, Viktoria Noka, and David Ritter, and they'll be presenting today. So Johanna, David, and Dylan will begin by comparing the cost drivers of electricity prices in Europe and Australia, which will include looking at wholesale and network costs, as well as environmental levies. And then Victoria and I will turn to the European and Australian efforts to try to address the unequal impacts of rising energy costs and the challenge of alleviating energy poverty. So I'll hand over to Dr. Johanna Cludius now.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sangeetha. My name is Johanna, and together with David and Victoria, I've been working on this project. We all work for the Öko-Institut. We're an independent and non-for-profit research institute that does work in the energy, climate, and environmental space, and we're based in Germany. For me personally, and I think for all of us, not only the combination of the Australian and EU perspective made this research so interesting, but also combining questions related to electricity markets and prices and questions related to hardship at the household level. So it kind of brought a lot of different perspectives together and helped us to gain a lot of new insights. And we'll dive right into this first part on electricity markets and prices. Next slide, please. By giving you a quick overview of the main findings, and then in the slides that follow, we'll look a bit deeper into some of the aspects. We found that both in Australia and the EU, the influx of renewables has reduced wholesale prices in the last few years, and is also focused to continue to do this in the near term. However, in the medium term, additional renewables and related lower wholesale prices are likely to drive the early exit of coal. I think this is a particularly hot topic in Australia right now. And if this happens, and particularly if this happens in an uncoordinated way, or if it happens in a less intensely interconnected market, this can cause price spikes. What's more, additional renewables also require stronger networks and or other balancing options, and these also have to be financed. And we see that both in the EU and particularly in Australia, network costs are already a very prominent component of household electricity prices. And the question of how to regulate networks and how to share costs between different types of consumers is definitely one that both Australia and EU countries are grappling with. Finally, we also had a look at environmental levies and taxes. From the point of view of household electricity prices, these play a much larger role in the EU. And while renewable subsidy programs have arguably brought down the investment cost for renewables globally, the related surcharges represent a considerable chunk of household electricity prices, especially in some of the EU countries that we looked at. We observe now, however, that especially those countries where the surcharges represent a particularly high share of household prices, these countries are moving towards financing these programs with other means, for example, out of the general budget. And with this, I'll hand over to David, and I think we can go to the next slide.
Thank you, Johanna. Yes, on this slide, we can see the energy prices in the EU. In green, we see the wholesale electricity market prices, and in blue, the development of the wholesale natural gas prices over the last years. And currently, we have the situation in Europe that the wholesale natural gas prices increased more than 400% compared to the year before. And this is mainly due to rising global demand after the COVID situation, but combined with lower than expected gas delivery from especially Russia, where mainly the gas is coming from for the European market. And also the CO2 prices increased, they doubled within 2021. And this led to substantially increased wholesale electricity prices, and they more than doubled compared to 2020. And the effect is mainly coming from gas prices. Approximately 90% of this effect is coming from gas prices, not from CO2 price. And the currently indications suggest that this price spike is likely to be temporary, and that the prices will go down again when supply and demand are balancing again. But looking at the situation in the last days with Russia, it's not yet really sure how it will develop, the supply of gas and also the prices. So this is an unsure situation that we are looking into. And then I think the next slide is coming from Dylan, who just came in.
Yeah, g'day. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sorry, perhaps maybe I got my time wrong. Yes, thanks for that, David. Yeah, so I guess it's a bit of a in a different direction. Residential electricity prices in Australia have actually been coming down in the last few, certainly in the last year and in the last couple of years. Yeah, they're actually the lowest they've been in about 8 years in real terms, and the biggest driver here is actually wholesale prices. That's the main cause of the price reductions. Network costs have also been gradually declining, or the network component of the bill, I should say, has declined after a period of overinvestment, which you can see on this graph around the middle of the graph in the 2013-14. That's the sort of the end of the gold plating kind of period, sort of inefficiently high investment in electric network costs, and they've been sort of gradually declining. And we also had slight decreases in retail margins and costs. But yeah, we'll talk a bit more about the wholesale price reduction and its sort of the dynamics around that and the impact that has on retail electricity prices in a couple of slides' time. But yeah, I might ask to move to the next slide now, please.
I don't think that's again me. So we are talking about the decarbonization of the electricity sector, but where are we currently in Australia and in Europe? On this slide, we can see with the brown lines the fossil shares of Australia and Europe, and the green ones, the renewable shares on the electricity generation. The straight lines are for Australia and the dotted ones for EU 27 countries. So we can see that for both countries, the shares were almost on a constant level until 2007 for EU and 2009, 2010 for Australia. And then got a shift from fossil to renewables, and renewable share increased, so that nowadays in Australia we are, one second, something like one quarter renewable share and 3/4 fossil shares. And in Europe, we have now the situation that fossil, or in 2020, fossil and renewable shares were almost on the same level, approximately 40%. We have to keep in mind that nuclear power is not in this graph and makes the rest of the electricity generation. So we are on a good way to increase renewables, but still have some efforts to manage to reach a fully decarbonized electricity system, both in Australia and in Europe. And then I think we can go to the next slide, and it's still me to talk. Yes, thank you. So on this slide, we can see for EU 27, 5 selected member states, the CO2 intensity in orange, the CO2 intensity of the electricity generation, and in blue, the electricity household prices over the last 10 years. And what we can see is that for most member states and EU27, electricity household prices increased until something like 2013, and CO2 intensity shows a declining trend over the last years, with different steepness of slope for the member states. And what we can see is that there is a decoupling of the development of household electricity prices and CO2 intensity becoming a part in the last 8 years, and that not in the same intensity, but also somehow, and for several member states, we can see also, like in Australia, that prices are going more downwards in the last year. And then back to Dylan again.
Sorry, I just muted myself after some loud typing, and now I have to talk again. Yes, so this is showing the expansion of, I guess, the delinking of decarbonisation with wholesale prices in the Australian context. I did see some questions from both Rob and I think Alan Pears about whether or not this included rooftop solar. This data set that I'm showing now does include behind the meter rooftop solar. The previous one was DISA data, and I apologize, I don't know off the top of my head if that did it or not, but this one certainly does. Yeah, so yeah, in Australia, with the expansion of renewable energy has resulted in emissions reductions occurring alongside reduction in price. As many of you will remember, there was a lot of hand-wringing about decarbonisation and wholesale electricity prices, particularly around the closure of Hazelwood. The real story here is, of course, not that simple. There are lots of complex interrelations to consider, particularly the big one, at least from my perspective, is the linkage with gas markets. And I have a whole paper on that if you're interested. But yeah, that aside, the influx of renewable energy in the last few years has seen both coal and, to a lesser extent, gas being displaced with commensurate reductions in emissions. And this has also contributed to a reduction in prices. As was the case with the Hazelwood story, the story is of course more complex, but that said, the addition of new low-cost marginal supply has substantially contributed to a fall in wholesale electricity prices, and this is sort of now well established, understood, and accepted by basically all the market bodies and participants. But yeah, in any case, in Australia, we've also seen in recent years emissions fall at the same time as prices. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is, I guess, where some of the complexity and nuance around this price reduction comes into the discussion. I guess as a result of this, the industry now expects there to be a lot of coal exit in the next decade. What we consider the most likely scenario in our main planning document sees about 14 gigawatts exiting the market by 2030. And that's essentially off the back of this phenomenon as well. And this year, I guess, for everyone in Australia, this will be no news to anyone. We've actually seen, we first saw AGL bring forward the closure of their plants only a couple of years. And more dramatically, last week, we saw Origin Energy bring forward the closure of its 2.8 gigawatt Eraring plant. That was 7 years earlier, which was actually quite a leap forward that I think has caught some people by surprise, others not so much, but to 2025. And then, of course, just this week, we've had that rather colourful intervention from the Mike Cannon Brooks Consortium that would see those AGL plants I mentioned before close even earlier, all of them by 2030. Now, these announcements alone, just from two companies, should they come to fruition, and it must be said, there's a lot of water to flow under the bridge before we can think that might actually happen. Then these ones alone are going to result in about 8 gigawatts of coal leaving And yeah, there's a couple of other plants that are expected to leave in that period as well, and others that are at risk in other jurisdictions. Now, you know, the impact of this is, I guess, you know, it remains to be seen. We do have I guess a different set of circumstances than we've seen with other coal plants. But the key thing that I'd like to, I guess, highlight is the uncoordinated nature of any withdrawal and the extent to which there is a price effect. You know, some kind of uplift or shock in price really comes down to this question around coordination and the degree to which, you know, we have enough new capacity in place before these plants close, particularly in our you know, long skinny NEM, which has that limited interconnection, unlike in the European Union, where there is that sort of more dispersed, you know, more integrated grid. So, you know, the loss of these, you know, Eraring is you know, it is only running at about 50% capacity factor or something at the moment, but it is 2.8 gigawatts of capacity that is there in the middle of summer when it's needed, and just removing that will you know, or has the potential to have a sort of a price effect. There are, you know, in the case of there are differences, as mentioned. I think one of the key ones is the amount of time that we've been sort of given here. One, you know, 3.5 years notice, as opposed to you know, 7 months, I think it was in the case of Hazelwood, and 9 months in the case of Northern in South Australia. So, you know, there is more time for a response, and there will undoubtedly be both private and public sector sort of funded initiatives to ensure that there is enough capacity and prices aren't, you know, there isn't too much of a shock. But then, having said that, there is, I guess, there's also the question of interconnection. That was actually a bit of a factor in the prices spikes that happened with the closure of Northern in South Australia. There was a network upgrade to the main interconnector Haywood that was, you know, essentially not completed in time, in line with, you know, when you'd want to have it in line, or you know, operating when the coal plant. There's about a 6 to 12 month period where it was sort of out of action or not at full capacity. That really, you know, had things been coordinated better, that could have been avoided. And we may have a similar situation with that with the closure of some of these plants, like the Eraring plant. You know, we've got namely the HumeLink project and the VNI West. You know, to the extent to which they get through approval and get built in that period of time, that remains to be seen. And, you know, whether or not there is a price shock is an open question. But there is it does highlight this need for, or this sort of question around the degree of coordination around these closures, which we basically don't have in Australia. We have that very, you know, laissez-faire, or let the market decide kind of approach. And I'll hand over to David for the next.
No, I think it's still slide before. There's still
yes.
2 bullets. Thank you. That's the one. So yeah, thank you, Dylan. In the EU, almost all member states have announced plans to phase out coal. But in contrast to the Australian situation that Dylan just described, the shutdowns of the European coal plants have mainly been a result of governmental requirements defining closure dates for the plants, and sometimes in combination with compensation payments. For example, in Germany, as Amanda also mentioned already before. But with strongly increasing carbon prices in the last month, and we have more and more market-driven retirement of coal plants that are announced. For example, in Greece or in Portugal, where they announced much earlier closure dates than they announced before when they had the discussion with the governments. And the supply side shock from the removal of thermal capacity is somewhat limited in Europe, as we have a much more deeply connected grid. And within the EU, we can see that countries with higher shares of renewable energy and entire interconnectivity have seen smaller increase in pricing during the current price spike, which was an interesting result for us from this review. And then I think it's Johanna.
It's back to me. Yeah, thanks a lot. Okay, now we're kind of moving from this discussion around prices to the discussion around, okay, what does this actually mean for households, different household types? So basically, these prices translate into costs for households depending on the amount a household uses, and the impact of these costs on households can be measured by comparing those costs with disposable income. And that's what we do in this graph. In this graph, you see by income quintile, from the lowest to the highest income quintile, left to right, the expenditure on electricity, gas, and other heating fuels for Australia and the EU. We included gas and other heating fuels here because in Australia, electricity is used for both cooling and heating. In the EU, the discussion around hardship has a lot to do with heating as well. So we thought including all of those gives us a more complete picture of the situation. What do we see here? We see that both in Australia and the EU, lower income households spend a lot more in relative terms on energy than high income households, although they spend a lot less in absolute terms, sort of dollar or terms, or use in terms of kilowatt hours. Actually, in the EU, the lowest income quintile spends about a quarter in absolute terms, or uses about a quarter of the energy that the highest income households use. But in terms of the impact is much larger on the low income households. What do we see as well? We also see that the average EU household spends a lot more than the average Australian households on electricity and heat. This, of course, has to do with heating requirements, but also within the EU, there are differences between different countries, and there are some countries like Finland and Sweden that have a colder climate, but where the average expenditure is actually relatively low. And this is because the expenditure also depends on things like efficiency of the heating system or efficiency of the building stock and the overall income level. And finally, we see here that while the average Australian household spends less than the average EU household, the dispersion between the income quintiles is larger in Australia, pointing to a particular need in Australia to look at those that could be in hardship. And this is something that Sangeetha is going to do, or where Sangeetha is going to pick up after a very short break, I think.
I think we might actually just keep going because we've ended up running a bit earlier, and maybe we'll just keep going through to the next slide. And thanks. So in this slide, this is a price trend analysis that was done by Ben Phillips at ANU for ACOS and the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence. So this is Australia only data. And this elaborates on what Johanna has been talking about, and it shows that the gap in expenditure shares between the lowest and the highest income earners has actually grown over time. It's important to keep in mind that how severe this can be. So for some of the lowest income earners, 1 in 4 are spending around 9% of their income on energy, and it can go even higher. So that's a really significant expenditure. most of these households are social security recipients. They're also largely private renters or public housing tenants. So that means they've got much less control over their energy bills. So I think this really speaks to the urgent need to improve people's capacity to pay. So a fair increase in social security payments, and also the need to be able to reduce the size of their energy bills. And this can occur through investment in energy efficiency, and also by having a fair regulated retail price for these customers. So from there, we're now going to talk a bit more about some of the initiatives to address energy poverty in the EU and the overall framework for this. So I'm going to hand over to Viktoria Noka now. Next slide, please.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for that, Sangeetha. So in this project, the first thing that we did was look at what is being done on the EU level to address kind of hardship, energy vulnerability, and affordability. And we found that the main language around this in the EU is around energy poverty. So we have in the EU a really strong foundation to recognizing and tackling energy poverty. And this is backed up by things like, for example, the just transition principle, which says that no one should be left behind in an energy transformation or in a transformation in the energy system. So this is really at the heart of what is being done at the EU level. And part of that is obviously working towards definitions of energy poverty. So energy poverty is understood as a situation where households don't have the means to adequately cool or heat their homes, or generally use the electricity that they need for a decent standard of living. But this is obviously a very broad definition, and on the EU level, there's a lot of work being done towards kind of making that definition a little bit more concrete. At the moment, the most concerted effort towards doing that is as part of the Social Climate Fund. This is a fund currently being set up to address exactly those discrepancies or social impacts that will happen due to the energy transition, and to just support the member states or the individual countries financially in making sure that we are following this just transition principle. Part of this definition of energy poverty is obviously developing indicators and having the data to identify energy poverty. So the majority of work on the EU level that's been done of this is done by the Energy Poverty Observatory. This was run for about 5 years. This was a concerted effort to set up indicators and to collate data on energy poverty. It includes 4 main indicators that are, on the one hand, about expenditure, the way that Johanna has just described. So looking at households that spend very little money on energy, or that spend a high proportion of their income on energy services, but also including self-reported indicators, like, for example, are you able to adequately heat your home? So we have kind of a wide range of indicators and quite a lot of data that has been kind of put into user-friendly setting, so that organizations like ourselves, but also the individual countries, can know or identify if they have a significant number of households in energy poverty. And a really important part of this is the fact that we have on the EU level designated institutions that work towards alleviating energy poverty. So the Energy Poverty Observatory was a key instrument in making sure that these indicators were being set up. And this is being now followed up by the Energy Poverty Advisory Hub, which is setting up a platform for regional governments, but also national governments, communities, to share and seek advice on tackling energy poverty. So on the one hand, identifying energy poverty, but also making sure that we have instruments, measures, and policies in place to actually then reach those households that are energy poor. And we see that a majority of those measurements and instruments focus on energy efficiency. So this really mirrors what is being done on the EU level, because energy efficiency is the key principle in the energy and climate policy on the EU level. but we see increasingly energy poverty being written into energy efficiency policies, recommendations, schemes. So for example, the large renovation wave, which seeks to double the number of renovations in the next 10 years in the housing stock in the EU, also has a lot of mention of energy poverty, energy vulnerability. So we see not kind of two separate strands emerging on the EU level, but energy poverty being thought of as an integral part in energy and climate policy. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Sangeetha to talk a little bit about what's happening in Australia in this.
Thanks, Victoria. So we're in Australia, and we have energy cost relief that's largely provided by subnational states, so energy concessions. There are also a range of complementary measures that can help to make electricity more affordable. I guess it's important to note, in terms of a bit of a difference with Europe, that electricity is a post-pay service in Australia for the most part, so it's generally not prepaid. There are really important exceptions to this, particularly in some of our most vulnerable remote First Nations, and that's definitely worthy of further exploration. But generally speaking, it's a post-pay service. There is a recognition of the choice to be disconnected, but under the National Energy Customer Framework, energy firms face obligations to both connect and to avoid disconnections, and they have to report on this to regulators. So energy retailers could lose their license if they're found to be breaching these obligations. There are a range of ombudsman schemes at the state levels to address consumer complaints against companies. There are referrals to third parties as part of the hardship management process. So this can include referrals to financial counsellors. There is this focus on trying to improve ability to manage bills, whether it be through fortnightly payment plans or arrears payment plans. Importantly, during the COVID lockdown period, the energy regulator issued a notice that retailers shouldn't disconnect customers who are in financial distress. And disconnections dropped significantly during that period, but they're now again on the rise. I guess in a comparative sense, one thing that's striking about Australia is the discourse is much more about promoting consumer agency and enhanced capabilities to participate in the market in order to improve those consumer outcomes. There's been a lot of work done recently on market participation, focused on the retail market. So fair pricing is important here, enhanced competition, and also information provision. Retail market reforms since 2018 have seen a default offer provided, which is like an effective price cap on electricity bills, which helps those who aren't shopping around and are stuck on expensive contracts. There have been bans on door-to-door sales and a focus on these some of these offers, which entice customers through short-term discounts that actually end up costing them more in the long run. A major gap when compared to the EU is on energy efficiency. So the poor quality of housing stock is addressed in a fairly limited way through energy efficiency upgrades, rather than through wholesale renovation of low-income housing stock. And there are some exceptions to this. The Victorian Big Build is trying to address this, as did the New South Wales Social Housing Bill. But really nothing on the scale that we see in the EU, particularly with the renovation wave. So energy efficiency improvements are important because they make longer-term impacts to bill reduction, and there are also obviously health and environmental co-benefits. Some research by ACOS and the Brotherhood showed that a small $5,000 investment in energy efficiency for low-income households can reduce their energy expenditure by more than 2% as a proportion of total income. So we find that in Australia, there are relatively few energy efficiency incomes that are targeted to low-income households, and they tend to be pretty small scale. Once again, there are some changes afoot, but nothing on the scale of what we're seeing in Europe. The term energy poverty is not widespread in Australia. It's more common to hear people talk about energy hardship or stress. And I'll talk a bit more about terminology later in terms of definitions and measurements. There's no national overarching framework for the energy efficiency, the energy transition that's underway that includes principles around equity and leaving no one behind. So it doesn't mirror what's going on in the EU at all. As many of you will know, the national electricity objectives don't reference equity or decarbonisation. And if there's no clear definition and therefore no clear objectives, it's very hard to set targets and develop metrics to collect data on the nature of the problem. There is no institution to monitor energy poverty as there is in Europe, and therefore no independent institution that can report on and make recommendations for how to alleviate energy poverty. Now, I will say that energy poverty doesn't necessarily need to be the term that gets taken up in Australia. Energy hardship and stress seem to have more traction in the existing discourse. Whatever we call it, we still think that there needs to be a much more robust effort to agree broad definitions so that it can then be measured, progress can be measured, targets can be set, and reporting can occur. Over to you, Victoria. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so of course, on the EU level, the big question is, okay, we have a strong framework, we have this written into EU recommendations and things like that, but how does that actually translate to the individual member states? This is a really important part of the way the EU works, of course. And the implementation of the measures and the instruments, but also the uptake of indicators and data, that all really happens at the member state level. And we see the majority of the extent to which this has been done in what are known as national energy and climate plans. And these are updated regularly. They have to be submitted by all of the member states. And they now include mandatory sections on energy poverty. So this is kind of a result of what's been happening on the EU level. But if we actually look at these energy and climate plans, we only see kind of some countries really adopting the instruments, looking at the data in their countries, analyzing those, while we see some countries not doing any of that at all. And a big part of that is that member states are only required to report on this if they find a significant number of households in energy poverty, without any real indication of when significant is met as a number. So we see kind of the work that's been done on the EU level in the last 8 to 10 years, strengthening that overarching framework, but we're now at a point where we really need to make sure that member states are adopting that really strong framework. Within those member states that are trying to do a lot to tackle energy poverty, we see energy efficiency, again, being the main way in which they can tackle energy poverty. Housing renovation policies, all of those dominate strongly in the national energy and climate plans. But we also see some mention of kind of direct financial support, some more short-term relief, social tariffs. So there's kind of a really broad range of the way in which different individual countries think or try to tackle energy poverty. But overall, it really has to be said that we see very little focus beyond the building sector. So this is in part because energy efficiency on the EU level has been pushed so hard as part of energy policy. So it's easier to integrate energy poverty alleviation measures within existing energy and climate policy. But we also need to move beyond the building sector. And what we can also see in these national energy and climate plans is that there's kind of a disconnect in some countries between, should we be tackling energy poverty as part of energy and climate policy, or is this really more something that should be tackled on a social policy side? So in those countries where there are maybe not as high levels of energy poverty based on those indicators from the observatory, we see countries opting to try to tackle those issues more through social policy, through social welfare schemes. For example, Sweden has decided that their social policy or their social welfare system is the way to go in terms of tackling energy poverty. So overall, we see a very differentiated approach to implementing what has been done on the EU level. So the framework is really important, it's really strong, it sets up a good basis to think about energy poverty. It's within policy discussion, but at member state level, this is really very, very differentiated in whether how much is being done at different country levels.
Thanks. I think we're on the next slide. So I think it's worth recognizing efforts to address energy hardship that are occurring at different scales in Australia. I was talking before about the emphasis on agency and building capabilities to participate in markets. So the idea is really well established in the Australian approach that multiple parties bear responsibility for enabling this, for enabling market participation and delivering benefits. And we're seeing this translate now with the shift to more distributed energy. So with the rapid rollout of solar and batteries and EVs that are coming, there are more providers and there are these complex cost allocations across the supply chain. And in our discussions with our European counterparts, we thought it was important to recognise that there's a maturing discussion in Australia about inequality and also the application of protections around new energy services. So there have been some key questions debated, policy conversations about what is essential and what is flexible load and how concessions should be applied to this. There are virtual power plants being developed for social housing in South Australia, for example. There's questions being asked about how you provide useful information and develop energy literacy to improve decision-making about new products and services. And there's a new voluntary code for new energy technologies that is requiring a higher standard for information provision, quality and service. I also just wanted to mention that smart meter deployment in some parts of Australia is well ahead of most parts of Europe. Having said that, I think the jury is still out on the benefits that this generates for households as a whole, but particularly for disadvantaged households. And I know that there are a number of projects that are emerging around this. I think it's a very important area of research. There's also the Energy Charter, which is an example of the industry playing a major role in cultural change in tackling affordability or seeking to play that role. So the Charter is led by CEOs of energy firms, and there's a commitment to improving energy affordability as part of that. And they sign up to accountability frameworks that can involve self-assessment and reporting. There's an independent panel review as well. And there are efforts to try and co-design programs with consumer groups and community organisations. So I just want to recognise that something like that can be influential, but it really requires buy-in from the largest firms as well as smaller firms. And I think the quality of engagement with consumer groups and communities is really, really important there. And I think there's some scope for improvement as well. I think it's increasingly important that people in communities are at the centre of the transition and the planning around the changes that occur. And I just wanted to mention the launch of Our Power tomorrow, which is a new effort, a renewed effort to articulate community values and vision for the energy system for key decision makers. And ACOS and a number of other groups are leading that. Next slide, thanks. And over to you, Victoria.
Yes, so Sangeetha has just mentioned a couple of things that are already happening in Australia. As part of our project, we also looked at what we might call best practice examples from Europe, just to give a bit of an overview of what are the kinds of measures and instruments that are being implemented by member states and other countries in Europe. And we try to categorize these along energy and climate policies that are being aware or integrating into their implementation how they can be socially fair or not disproportionately disadvantage low-income or vulnerable households. But we also look at how these can protect consumers, how they increase participation, or can help develop resilience. So in terms of energy and climate policy, just to pick up a few examples in this table, in Germany, there's been a lot of discussion around the cost of CO2 pricing and how those are being passed on to households and how those can be distributed, or how there can be a limited pass-through of CO2 costs for tenants with the heating, for example. In terms of protections, we think mostly along the lines of regulatory instruments. So the disconnection protections in the UK, for example, are really strong. There's a whole range of protections, which kind of is similar to what's been happening in Australia. But we also see kind of social tariffs being implemented in various countries for vulnerable consumers. In terms of participation and being able to take advantage of new infrastructures and new technologies, there's very far less of that being done in Europe. So this really isn't the focus of the measures that have been taken there. But we see some increased smart meter uptake in Italy, for example, some experiments with thinking about how tenants can take advantage of PV and self-generated electricity in Germany as well. But the main focus in Europe has been on resilience, so on energy, increasing energy efficiency and providing kind of direct financial support to households. So we have a really interesting range of measures there between, for example, the Habitat Mieux program in France, which provides financial support for large-scale renovations, but also things like the electricity saving check, which offers really small solutions at household level, like changing the light bulbs, for example, to just improve your energy efficiency in your house. And again, in the UK, we see an interesting example of taking energy companies on board and making sure that they are obligated to also deliver energy efficiency in households generally, but specifically low-income households. And in terms of the direct financial support, we then see really short-term support being also implemented alongside the long-term support through energy efficiency measures. So there are direct funds that the low-income households can access, but in Germany, there's also an interesting example of the climate bonus, where those households receiving social welfare payments can receive a bonus to rent more expensive but more energy efficient housing, for example. So there's a broad range of examples that we've listed here. If you are interested in knowing a little bit more about each of these projects, there's been a report that we released in December on the Öko-Institut website. We can post a link into the chat where these are listed in a lot of detail in fact sheets towards the end. So just to give a little bit of an overview of what are the kinds of measures that are happening on the EU level or in Europe more generally to tackle energy poverty. So I'm now going to hand over to Sangeetha to just wrap up this section.
Thanks, Viktoria. So we've discussed shared lessons going both ways between Europe and Australia, and I think it's important to emphasize that there really is no simple cut and paste solution that can be just transplanted from Europe to Australia. And we need to recognize that the social, institutional and geographic specificities of energy in Australia requires tailored responses. And I think it's really important that we have more research on addressing affordability and hardship in Australia that is Australia specific and recognises diversity in different regions of Australia. And that's been a real feature of the body of research that's developed in Europe out of the Energy Poverty Observatory. Being able to look at different countries and subnationally as well, look at different types of households and the different drivers. And it really has developed a very rich picture of the diversity of the experience of energy poverty and therefore helped in the design of different measurements, multi-dimensional indicators, as well as more effective responses. We've observed that in Europe, there's a much more coordinated and top-down approach than Australia, but that the response at the member state level is uneven. But the EU definitely has a stronger framing in terms of a just and fair transition and leaving no one behind. Energy efficiency is particularly strong in Europe compared to Australia. And we see in Australia that the scale and scope of energy efficiency interventions, particularly for low-income households, needs to be enhanced in order to really shift the dial on energy poverty and hardship. There's a recognition that the cross-sectoral nature of the phenomenon of energy poverty, and that this requires coordination across social, economic, and environmental policies. And this is a real challenge in developing policies for government. Australia's emphasis on market participation and on consumer choice and voluntary regulation can drive bottom-up change, and it can be effective and long-lasting under certain conditions. However, we really want to emphasise that there need to be top-down and bottom-up approaches to this complex problem. And the last point that we really want to emphasise is that if you can't define a problem, you can't measure it, and therefore you can't address it. So we would call for a national effort to understand and define the nature of energy poverty or hardship, whatever the term is you want to call it, and to be able to debate in the Australian context and come to some kind of agreement on appropriate measurement, data collection and reporting. And we would argue that an independent institution is needed to do this kind of reporting. So that's it from our project. And just to remind you that this report is available on the website, and I think Angela has put this into the chat. And if you want any more detail, please have a look at that report. You can ask us questions as well. And we're now going to have Q&A, which apparently I'm moderating. So I might ask, because we've got a small but very knowledgeable audience, if people would like to unmute to answer a question, feel free. I'm also looking in the question and answers as well. And questions on any part of the report. Shall I read? There's a question from Alan about the role that Energy Consumers Australia can play in this area. I wonder whether there's anyone in the audience who is more involved in an advocacy sense and wants to respond to that. I mean, I do think Energy Consumers Australia has done some good research in this space and continues to do regular consumer surveys. And they have had quite a strong emphasis on issues of literacy as well, energy literacy, and working with diverse communities on this. And I know that they're actively involved in this Our Power launch tomorrow. And they do commission research in this area, but they could also be perhaps an important institution that that does more of this, raises these questions and tries to bring people together to agree on the nature of the problem, definitions, tools for measuring, and also reporting. But if anyone else has anything they'd like to add, happy to hear it. And there's a question comment from Emma. I'm just going to read it out. The difference between the EU and Australia seems to be high household solar penetration. What role do you see household solar playing in alleviating energy poverty and delivering community benefits rather than just individual benefits, such as looking ahead, e.g. looking ahead, can community batteries distribute surplus energy at no cost? So I might take that, and Dylan might also want to add something here. I do think that there are a range of much more innovative, community scale, new energy initiatives, such as community batteries, that can be developed and can look at this question of how you deliver benefits back to low-income households who are particularly affected by the fact that they don't own their own home and have the rooftop space nor the financial capital that's required to benefit from rooftop solar and batteries. And I think there are some groups looking into this. I know the ANU has a good project on community batteries specifically. I think some of the work on embedded networks that's going on in Victoria, and also social housing and renovations that include solar and also energy efficiency upgrades could be really important here. And I mentioned the virtual power plant in social housing in South Australia as well. So I think these are exactly the kinds of initiatives that need to be discussed more research and more analysis about how this can address that uneven distribution of benefits from the energy transition.
Sorry, go on.
I was just going to, if it's okay, I was just going to add to that. I think the question is actually spot on to point to this as a key difference between the EU and Australia. That's actually, I think, it sort of points to that that sort of more consumer centric and individual agency kind of approach in Australia compared to the top down sort of some of the differences there. In the European Union, we sort of have this sort of more consumer protection or sort of kind of approach compared to for these individual products that we're using to produce power, which is something that's, I think, not, maybe the Europeans might be able to talk to this, but it's not as that sort of approach is not as ingrained or not as present in the European context. And yeah, as Sangeetha said, there's quite a lot of work going on in this space. And yeah, reiterate the ANU project she mentioned. I've got the name of the project, but it's a really kind of interesting one at the forefront of this sort of area. I think there are a lot of regulatory barriers and challenges to making this work and making it fair and equitable, and also institutional sort of barriers as well. But it's definitely a key difference, and there's a lot of opportunity there, but it's not an easy nut to crack, and people have been trying to do that for, I think, at least 10 years, probably longer.
Thanks, Dylan. We've got a comment from Rob Murray-Leach that points to the difference in the quality of building stock, which is so much worse in Australia than Europe, which necessitates a different focus. In Europe, it's okay to focus on reducing energy costs, whereas in Australia, perhaps it's better to focus on ensuring homes have basic features for health and well-being, such as reverse cycle heating, air conditioning, and insulation, which can deliver substantial energy savings. I think that's a comment, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. Just to say that we do need to focus on both, and that, like you say, those kinds of upgrades have co-benefits, and they also reduce energy costs over the medium to long term.
Yeah, maybe quickly on that as well. I mean, I guess in the EU there's differences between different countries, but I guess in general the comment is true that maybe the health issue, we have a little less the health issue and more the energy cost issue than in Australia. But related to, so what should we focus on? We should probably keep in mind that once we make an investment in the building sector, these investments have a very long lifetime. So I don't know, boilers are used for like 30 years and insulation maybe 40 years. And this means that we're actually making a decision now that's influences energy use even in decades time. So I don't know, right now the discussion in the EU and also in Germany, well, it's very much about how, like, can we phase in more efficiency, or do we have to kind of go all in now to make sure that we can get even close to reaching climate goals when we need to?
Thanks, Johanna. Dylan, do you want to have a go at this question from David, which is around the high supply service charge and how that disincentivizes potentially consumers choosing renewable energy sources? Dylan, are you still there?
You muted still?
Sorry, I think that actually, in a way, plays on to a comment that Rob's actually made about, I guess, a strong focus on supply and renewable energy, and adding PV. Yeah, it's got to, you've got to remember that's not the only, or perhaps even the best thing to do for addressing some of these issues. And yeah, I think yeah, supply service charges. In some ways, it also comes back to that question we were talking about before around you know, the different business models and regulatory barriers and approaches to having, you know, some of these different approach, you know, with whether it's batteries or distributed energy or, you know, virtual power providers. These sort of questions around bill structures and tariff structures are tied up in that. And yeah, I guess it's sort of it's a hard one to disentangle. It's like, what is the objective you're trying to, you know, encouraging people to buy renewable energy is one thing you can do, but it's not the only thing, and it's not the thing that's necessarily best for reducing their electricity bills or reducing their you know, their sort of vulnerability to electricity bill shock, etc. So yes, the supply charge as it currently stands, and there's also problems with the way the supply charge is done now, does disincentivize, or may disincentivize the ability to put on PV or choose more renewable energy, but also that's not necessarily the only objective or the best objective to help with energy affordability in that case. So.
If there's not another question sitting around, can I ask one?
Please.
Yeah, I haven't heard much talk yet about ideas like, I guess it's summarized as the death spiral, which I think is perhaps not the best term for it, but the idea that we may finish up with a fairly strong separation of people who are able to take advantage of and engage with new technologies and probably reduce their costs, and perhaps beyond just the questions of what current vulnerabilities are out there and how that might be increased by an overall increase in costs, that we might leave people with the increasingly expensive and hard to maintain part of the network. Is that something which is figuring in the discussions in either jurisdiction, and is it kind of an obvious problem to deal with? Is it just we just have to make sure that the market exits are coordinated and it's all fine, or is this actually, it looks hard from outside?
Peter, I'll just start, but I might throw to our European colleagues while we've got them. I think that the idea that there could be this residualized group who face higher costs because their belief means to engage the energy transition is a critical issue, and that price dispersion graph that we're showing kind of suggests that it's growing over time, and potentially one of the causes of this might be getting left behind and not being able to invest in these new energy saving opportunities. So it'd be good to hear from our European colleagues about whether this is a live issue in Europe and how that's being discussed.
Okay, maybe I'll start. I think just because of climatic conditions, we have a little bit less the problem that sort of households go off the grid completely, but we definitely have seen quite a lot of research out there that it's mainly higher income households that have installed renewables with the help of subsidies and that have benefited in that way. But I guess within the course of this research, we've also realized that while this is a really big question in Australia, that actually in the EU, like beyond this question, so who took advantage of the subsidies, this hasn't been discussed so much, like in what way, or not as prominently, in what way can households participate in the energy transition? I'll maybe hand over to Viktoria, who has researched some programs.
Yeah, that's definitely the case, that the uptake of new technologies is discussed far less, and it's not part of what the energy poverty discussion at all. So in terms of those households being able to take advantage, is more the question is, how are we going to make sure that those households are even taking advantage of energy efficiency measures, and making sure that those who live in the worst homes or the worst houses basically can actually improve their energy efficiency. So it's far less about kind of making sure that they have access to those new technologies like PV, which is what a lot of the discussion in Australia seems to be about. It's a lot more about making sure that doing exactly that, which we discussed in the comment earlier, that those households living in poor conditions improve their energy efficiency, and then that's like kind of the first step that they take. So for example, especially in the United Kingdom, where the housing stock is still really quite bad, this has been really the focus of energy poverty measures rather than thinking about access to new technologies.
Thanks, Victoria, and thanks for the question, Peter. We've got time for one last question quickly, and I think it's from Damien Sullivan for Brotherhood, pointing out that in Australia we don't factor in health and wellbeing co-benefits of residential energy efficiency at all. And the question is, in the EU, are these health benefits accepted by treasuries in their evaluation of the programs?
Very little, to be perfectly honest. There is some discussion, especially in those countries where heating is more of a problem rather than cooling. So again, in the UK, this is a really big point of discussion, where energy efficiency measures are marketed not only as your energy bills will go down, but you will also have significant benefits, health benefits. But that's really specific to the United Kingdom and maybe a little bit in Ireland as well. But this isn't really that big of a part of the discussion in countries like Spain, France, Belgium, where there are quite significant energy poverty measures in place, and they're trying to tackle that. You very rarely see an intersection of those kinds of cross-cutting benefits. So it's all about the building sector rather than trying to see those cross-cutting issues. But just maybe to note, there is the Right to Energy Coalition, which is a coming together of kind of academics, governmental partners, NGOs, activists on the EU level, which are trying to promote these kinds of discussions. So that's kind of happening on kind of a different level away from the EU governmental stuff and from the member state. But so there are these discussions happening, but we don't really see it reflected in any of the kind of official documentation or anything like that.
Thanks, Victoria. Probably worth also pointing out that it is actually International Energy Poverty Action Week this week, and there's a whole lot of stuff going on across the world. But Engager and some of the other groups involved in that energy coalition in Europe, it's worth checking out their website and having a look at the discussion. I think it's the first ever International Energy Poverty Action Week. I think I have to call it to a close now.
Yeah.
Peter, can I hand over to you for that?
Absolutely. Yep. So first, thanks very much to all our presenters. Particular thanks to the Europeans who got up at a bit and started presenting on Zoom at a particularly uncivilized hour. So thanks very much for doing that. The last question was, I didn't plan it, but it's a perfect segue into tomorrow. We're actually going to talk specifically about the healthcare benefits of essentially working on the energy transition, on the general support of the Paris Agreement, and just kind of what comes along with that. I do find it extraordinary that Victoria's comment in Europe, given the amount of work that's been done on the interaction of extreme weather, poverty, and health, that the idea that questions about energy, which is clearly a key mitigating device for these things, is not factoring as strongly into that point as it might. And I mean, I think there is at least some discussion of that in Australia. Whether it's making it through to policy, it's another question. But my editorial comments aside, I would welcome people back tomorrow to think a little further about two remaining aspects that we've looked at. One on the healthcare benefits, and the other on how we finance this effort. What's a sustainable way for us to build financial instruments to help us support the Paris Agreement and similar instruments? And then we'll be discussing a few next steps and the ways forward. So thanks again very much to our presenters. A beautiful kind of coordinated presentation. We didn't take our break. It turned out we needed not to. That was a really good section of Q&A at the end. So thanks for those who stayed with us through the entire time. And we'll catch up again tomorrow.